Welcome to the 9th season of the Summer Solstice series at First Presbyterian Church, Salina, Kansas. Hello, I'm Martha Ray. Sydney Soderberg and I are the coordinators of the Summer Solstice series. In planning the 2020 programs, we knew that we couldn't ignore our current time of disruption and uncertainty. In the midst of so much confusion, we took the opportunity to bring together the best local and national minds in a virtual format to explore this year's theme, the edges of new community. Today is the first in that series, and it's titled, In a Time of COVID, Fear, Loss, and Change. Panel members are Father Frank Cody, pastor of St. Thomas More Church in Manhattan, Kansas, Governor Laura Kelly, the governor of the state of Kansas, and Dr. Paula Freed, psychologist in private practice in Salina, and a community activist. The panel is moderated by Professor Gerald Gillespie, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Kansas Wesleyan University. Please take note that you, as an audience member, are able to submit questions by email to communications@fpcsalina.org. That's communications@fpcsalina.org. These questions will be compiled into the final session on August 19th. And finally, remember that this program can be viewed anytime at this location, and do invite others to join you as well. And now, Professor Gillespie.
Okay. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists here, but especially welcome all of you who are viewing this panel discussion. Thank you all for joining and watching this 2020 Solstice series, and particularly engaging yourselves with what you will hear from our first panel of presenters. I want to especially thank this quite distinguished panel for taking time from their very busy schedules, and indeed, they are all very busy because of this unique and unique time, and also because of the important service roles that they are playing during this COVID pandemic time. Our panelists are Kansas Governor Laura Kelly, Dr. Paula Freed, an author and clinical psychologist here in Salina, Kansas, and Father Frank Cody, who is pastor of St. Thomas More Church in Manhattan, Kansas, and director of liturgy and adult education of the Diocese of Salina. Before I say a little bit about the program, because Governor Kelly's schedule is particularly busy, she will unfortunately have to leave our panel a little bit early. However, we are especially grateful for her affording the time for us today. Our topic is, in a time of COVID, fear, loss, grief, and change. I will have a series of questions for each of our panelists as a way of beginning an ongoing conversation here and later discussion among all of us. I would like to encourage everyone who is watching to consider formulating your own questions on our topic also. Because of our present format and the time limitations now, we intend to try to address viewer questions later on at our third panel on August 19th. I'll give you more information on that at the end, and I'll tell you where you can email those questions again at the end of our panel today. Again, Governor Kelly is needing to leave early, so we wanted to begin with her today and get her reflections on this historical moment of change in Kansas, and particularly on her sense of this unique disruption, the sense of loss and change I think that we're all feeling in the state, and the changes that are really underway in many aspects of our community lives in the state. So with that, I want to welcome Governor Kelly and both of our panelists. And I'd like to ask Governor Kelly to start with just, as we watch the Kansas scene, we're well aware of all the challenges you're facing and the kinds of choices that we're all going to have to deal with now and down the road. And they're front and center every day, at least in the news I'm watching. So I'd like to hear how you would characterize the kind of change and particularly the kind of harm that the pandemic is giving to Kansas here. And we'll have some follow-up questions on, you know, where we go from here and so on. But I think a lot of us are feeling the old normal is going to be really hard to come by. And there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about what the future is going to be like, not only in Kansas, but in the States. So if you could give us a little bit of your own reflections on some of that, I think we'd all appreciate it.
Well, I'll do that, and thank you, Professor Gillespie. But first, I'd like to express my appreciation to the organizers from the First Presbyterian Church there in Salina for actually inviting me to participate in this conversation with these other stellar panelists, Father Frank Cody and Dr. Paula Freed. I understand that beyond this, you have a fantastic lineup of speakers throughout the series. From KU Professor Kevin Wilmot and my friend, former Governor Kathleen Sebelius. So I'm sure that each discussion will be robust and thoughtful and engaging for all. And as you all know, the past several months have been extremely challenging for people in our state, actually in the nation, and all across the world. COVID-19 has no doubt upended all of our lives. And we've dealt with hardships we could never have imagined. The virus has forced business to close, caused thousands of hardworking Kansans to be laid off and furloughed. Our friends, our loved ones have gotten sick or been hospitalized, and tragically more than 300 Kansans have lost their lives to this virus. But throughout all of this, I am very proud to say that Kansans, by and large, have been resilient and compassionate. They've served as a strong reminder that we can and we will make it through this together. It won't be quick, it won't be easy. From the health of our economy to the political climate, the effects of the coronavirus simply aren't going to go away overnight. But that doesn't mean that we can't rally together now to improve the outcomes. Currently, Kansas is at what feels like a make it or break it moment. On Monday, during my weekly news conference, I unfortunately had to announce that once again, our state's numbers were at an all-time high. Last week in the Kansas City area, the KC Metro recorded more than 400 new COVID-19 cases each day for 4 days in a row. Then on Tuesday, KC Metro once again broke its own record of increased case numbers, adding nearly 650 positive cases in one day. It is vital to the health of our state's economy and to the well-being of our dedicated business owners and workers that we flatten this curve, that we keep our Kansas businesses open, and that we send people back to work. However, rising numbers are not our only concern. We have seen a rift growing deeper between political parties in our country, a rift that has prevented state and local governments from making tough but necessary decisions in the interest of public health. The potential for long-term negative impacts on our political world, our economy, and our various institutions is certainly possible. But luckily, it is not too late for Kansas. My administration took steps early in the pandemic that put us on a trajectory for success, and we still have an opportunity to flatten the curve once again. To be clear, no matter what, our recovery from this pandemic won't be quick, won't be easy. It'll take a lot of hard work, collaboration, and dedication. But if we can put politics aside and act in the best interest of Kansans, if we can make a commitment to wearing masks, to social distancing, and to practicing good hygiene, if we can safely send our kids back to school and keep our economy humming, we will see the impact of the virus minimized. I would encourage Kansans, all Kansans, to do their part and to protect their friends, their neighbors, along with themselves, and remain forever hopeful. And with that, I look forward to participating in some discussion with you, Professor, and with our other panelists.
Question that came to mind just thinking about this entire program, that the pandemic is really exposing a lot in that sense. We can talk about this as rather apocalyptic in that sense. It's revealing a lot about infrastructure problems and so on. And in many ways, it's exposing illusions we may have about things we thought we had been doing right. And you've talked about some of those too. Issues around, race and health and the Medicaid issues, social justice, and so on. What sort of hopeful signs do you see? What sort of positive things do you see able to come out of this, correcting our thinking, correcting our vision about how we need to work as a society, as a political system, and so on? I think people are feeling some deeper anxieties about our institutions generally.
Well, and I think that the virus really has put the spotlight on a number of inequities in our systems. Clearly, the systemic racism that exists across the board has been made very, very clear. We see it just in the health disparities. The impact of this virus on our communities of color has been astronomical, and far out of proportion to their population numbers. So I think, it takes us back and reminds us of the things that we should have done before, but certainly need to do as we move forward. You mentioned Medicaid expansion, and that is clearly one. So we have folks who just don't have access to healthcare and need it. And so that would be the one thing I would point out. But I think the other thing that it is pointed out, and maybe even in a good sense, is that we've been talking for a long time about investing in broadband and being able to bring access into not only our rural communities, but our lower income communities where it may not be the Wi-Fi that they need connection to, but they actually needed the laptop. So the virus has pointed out the importance of doing something about that, and actually I think has driven both Congress and the state legislature here to put some emphasis on that, to invest in those kinds of things, so that as we go forward, we'll be better able to do distance learning, which is vital during the pandemic, but it's also important when we're not in crisis, just to bring really robust curriculum to some of our rural areas where it's difficult to find particularly specialty teachers.
Mm-hmm. I knew this would happen. We only have a few minutes left with the governor. So I would like to quickly invite Frank and Paula into the conversation if they have some questions they'd like to ask of the governor as well.
I have a question, Governor Kelly. You mentioned systemic racism, and as many of us are working hard to understand those kinds of structural and systemic issues, it feels a little overwhelming about how to even begin to address them. And I'm wondering if you've given thought to that at the policy level. Like, what would it look like for us to work on that?
Well, actually, I've already taken a major step. I created a commission on racial equity and justice, and I've convened I wish I could show you who's on there. Just an incredible group of folks from all walks of life who bring tremendous expertise and personal life experience in many cases to the table. And their first task is really to take a look at what's going on in our law enforcement world, to see what we need to do there to deal with some of the immediate issues that have become very clear to us after the George Floyd murder. So we've got that going on. They'll address the law enforcement issue first, but then their charge really is to stay at the table as long as they need to look at everything else, to look at education, to look at healthcare, to look at our economic system, and wherever else racism really exists, housing, for instance. So they're there, they're working. They really are incredible human beings, and they will be bringing others, a lot of stakeholders to the table to gather as much information as they can and design a strategy to make long-term, deep-rooted change in our culture here in the state of Kansas.
Mhm.
Great.
That's encouraging to hear, yes. We've got about a minute or so. Could I quickly ask, I think all of us are curious. We're going to be talking about balancing our own lives with all this loss and grief and trauma shortly. But I guess the question to you is, with all that's going on with your life, what do you do? Can you, how are you adjusting to keeping balance in your own life and family and work and so on together? Because those are the kind of issues I think most of the rest of us are trying to do as well.
Well, one of the things I'm doing is I'm hosting my oldest daughter and her husband for the summer. They are New Yorkers. They live in Brooklyn. And it's very difficult to be in New York right now. Both of them are able to work from home. So they are summering with us here in Topeka. And so that's one change. And it's been great. I mean, I haven't spent this much time with my kids in a long time. So that part's good. I think, I tend to dive into information when I'm stressed, and I can't really say I'm particularly stressed, but I've got a lot of things to do, and so I need good information, and that's exactly what I've been doing. I've been spending just about every moment of the day that I'm available, either meeting with folks, primarily virtually, to gather information that will help me do my job, or I read an incredible amount. In fact, I just finished The Great Influenza, John Barry's book, which talks about the 1919 flu. And that's been really good to help me put all of this in perspective, but also to give me hope, that we will get through this. Yeah. There are a lot of things we have to do, a lot of things we have to do right in order to get through this, but we will. And so just keeping my eye on the future and realizing that this will be over. And so what do I need to do now to be best positioned, both personally, but then also to best position the state. And so, while we're dealing with the day in and day out crisis of the pandemic, the other thing that we're doing is long range planning so that we are really ready to kickstart when the virus allows us to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. But thank you for sharing all of this time this morning. We wish we had a lot more of time with you, but it's certainly appreciated, and we're going to miss you. But anyway, we know you have things to do right away. So.
And I'll be able to watch this series, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It will be recorded. Yeah.
I'll do that. Well, thank you all. Appreciate the invitation. Take care.
Thank you very much. Well, now we're down to 3. Okay. But this is the very special couple that I'm anxious to hear from on the kind of issues around fear and loss and grief and so on. Both Frank and Paula are friends, but they've also always been community sources of wisdom and of service. So I think you'll all appreciate the kind of things they have to share with us. I'd like to begin here with Paula, just a brief kind of comments to start with. If anything, it seems to me this pandemic time is one of reflecting on what normal is for us individually, but also collectively, and also looking at ourselves a little bit more directly, sorting through things, letting go of things that are necessary and unnecessary, prioritizing things. But it's also a time of dealing with what I've heard described as a kind of survival anxiety as well, because there's a lot of uncertainty for the future, fears, frustrations, and so on. So there's different levels of pain and trauma that are part of this kind of change in society. So Paula is unique in being able to share with us, I think, on what about this psychological change and the grief process that we're, I think, in some ways going through because we're having to let go of what we thought of as normal and find a new way of adjusting to this. If you could speak to us, Paula, about the nature of this trauma and grief process, its significance, and its effects on us as we try to move forward with all that, I think we can all benefit from your observations here. So feel free.
Great, thank you, Jerry. And it really is an honor to be part of this great panel, and a delight to connect with both you and Father Frank. So let me begin by just talking a little bit about grief. Grief can refer to the acute pain that comes with loss. Symptoms of grief can include sadness, of course, that's the first thing we think of, but also difficulty finding pleasure in activities that usually bring pleasure, and a lack of motivation to take care of things that need to be done, maybe even taking care of ourselves. But grief can also describe the process of adapting to the loss that we've experienced, the process of reconfiguring our life in the presence of this new absence. In this sense, we think of grief as something we move through as we find our way to an understanding of our changed circumstances. Some of the losses caused by COVID-19 are obvious, and the governor mentioned many of them: loss of health, the death of a loved one, loss of a job, loss of the normal routines of going to work, our children going to school, in this summer watching our children's sporting activities that we might be used to doing, maybe even going to church. But there are other losses that are not so obvious, what psychologists call the ambiguous losses. These losses don't have the clarity or specific focal point of a death or a job loss. And in some ways, they're more difficult to manage because sometimes we really don't know what we're feeling. For example, the pandemic has shaken our sense of control, our sense of safety, our belief in our ability to take care of our children and our families. It's disrupted our social connections. We may feel frightened and uncertain as we observe the challenges that our schools are facing, for example, as they prepare to reopen, or that our healthcare system is facing as it tries to deal with this coronavirus, the challenges that our economy is facing. We may be frightened about the difficulty that we're having as a country bringing the coronavirus under control. And as we've never lived through anything like this, we can't predict what losses lie ahead for us. You touched on that, Professor Gillespie, in your introduction. And that creates yet another layer of anxiety and concern. We wonder when life will get back to normal, or what it will be like, and if it will ever be like it was before. We wonder about the long-term consequences of what we're going through now on our children, on our community, on our economy. So we are grieving in anticipation of future losses, even as we are grieving our current losses. Sometimes a first step in moving through the grief process is taking inventory of what we've lost, naming the challenges we are facing so that we can see the work that is ahead for us. I'd like to touch upon one other idea in this introduction here, and that comes from the work of psychiatrist Dan Siegel at UCLA. He is just a luminary in the mental health field right now, and he's played a very important role in our growing understanding of what constitutes psychological well-being in general, and healing from traumatic or difficult experiences in particular. Dan Siegel says that in terms of our overall well-being and ability to function well, what happens to us isn't as important as how we make sense of what has happened. He describes this sense-making process as one of creating a coherent narrative, a story about our lives that promotes a deepened understanding of who we are and why we are who we are. Many of us haven't had the opportunity to think about this, to consider how the various fragments of memory and lived experience fit together to help us understand ourselves. But it can be a very useful and important process. And as I reflect on this particular moment, I think that we have the opportunity as we deal with this pandemic to respond in a way that enriches and deepens that storyline, our understanding of ourselves. How do we see ourselves as we confront the many challenges and losses that are marking this moment? How do we increase our capacity to be resilient, to see ourselves as people who get through hard times? How do we move through this time in a way that has meaning and purpose? And let me clarify what I mean here so that's a little bit less abstract. For some people right now, their sense of moving through this time is aided by seeking out the opinions of experts and find purpose and meaning in following expert advice as best they can and keeping themselves safe and the community safe. Others are finding meaning in staying in touch with isolated family members or friends, or taking a meal to someone who can't get out. Others are finding meaning by becoming more involved politically, calling representatives, signing petitions, encouraging others to vote. For others, relying on religious faith as a guide and regularly connecting with a faith tradition provides deep meaning. Others are finding ways to safely volunteer with organizations or causes that are important, and that lends a sense of meaning. Others are lucky to find meaning in their job, their paid work, or perhaps in what they do outside of their paid work, their own passions that they are pursuing. So it's really important to think about that at a difficult time like this, it can be really helpful to be very intentional about how we see ourselves in terms of who we are at our core, who we are in our relationships with others, and who we are as a community.
There's so much there in what you shared, Paula. One of the things that really struck me was this whole emphasis on the narrative that we weave around ourselves. If people are like me, I've tried to do a little bit of house cleaning and a little bit of sorting of memories and so on that I haven't had time to do before. And a lot of friends I know are doing far more than I'm doing on that. But I've noticed whenever I give time to that, it evokes this need to reframe my sense of myself and look at the narrative I have about myself. And it also makes me wonder if that's really what's happening in our larger society, that the pandemic is giving us time to reflect on the narratives around race, around poverty, around around wealth inequality and so on, and that there's a lot of competition and civil unrest in part to try to dominate the narrative or create the narrative in some ways. Could you comment on some of that? Again, we're running out of time. We're going to have to just get together and spend 2 or 3 hours, I think, on this. But please feel free to share on anything.
Well, just a couple of thoughts. The process you're describing of so lovely of going through belongings, clearing out and then finding images or souvenirs or writings that deepen or make us modify our sense of ourselves. And Dan Siegel talks about this process of continually taking the story that we know about ourselves and then seeing how it's challenged by current circumstances, situations. Where do we need to modify our story? And I think that's exactly right. And at some point, I'd like to talk about that more, the weight of understanding that our national story is contested right now. And I don't mean by outside others. I mean like the stories we've wanted to tell about ourselves as a country and, freedom and for all and equal opportunity. We're seeing so clearly, like Governor Kelly said, how not true that is. And that's requiring us to engage in a really painful reconfiguring of that way we understand ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think the weight of that is, again, one of those ambiguous losses that it's hard to name, but I think we feel it.
Yeah. And it strikes me that when things seem really bad and disorienting, those are really that's the beginning of how we change, really transform at a deeper level, I think, you know, and it's as frustrating as that is, it's just the reality, I think.
Right. So
But it's
true.
also a great opportunity.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right. Yeah.
You know, I too love that notion of the narrative, and it made me think of the Bible, which is a story, you know, and the Bible that we have, what we would call the canonical scriptures, the official texts. In the 20th century, we began to find other manuscripts that are non-canonical, but in the canonical version of the Old Testament, for example, you know, the story of the Exodus is told over and over again by different writers and different editors, you know, making different points out of it, but also the exile. And the exile is somewhat similar to our pandemic, you know, the deep psychological devastation of a people because of the failure and the loss and the lack of control and actually being, you know, overcome by superior powers and exiled and all that kind of stuff. But the prophets, you know, the major prophets, and it strikes me as interesting how often those come up in our Catholic lectionary, where they're explaining the exile. You know, they are controlling the narrative about what the meaning of the exile is, and so the exile was out of their control. It happened, but now what's the meaning?
Yeah.
You know, what's the narrative that we're going to create around this? That's going to get us through this into the next phase of our national and personal lives. And I think that's very similar. You know, I don't want to blow this all out of proportion, but I think there are a lot of similarities what we're going through with COVID-19. We're experiencing all that loss, all that grief and suffering, and we're looking for a narrative. Mm-hmm. And that challenges me when I'm preaching, mm-hmm. to be a little bit more specific about you know, helping people write their narrative.
Mm-hmm. You know, to go back to a point made with Governor Kelly, it really does feel like illusions we have about that narrative are really being exposed. Yeah. You know, that we've been dealing with a reality that's not true for many people, maybe even including ourselves, and we haven't been able to see that. And so there's reason to take heart and to look at the positive on that in some ways, you know?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, did it take the pandemic for us to finally see how unjust we are and how prejudiced we are? You know, obviously the videoing of some horrific crimes by police, you know, that exacerbated it for sure. But did the COVID situation also contribute to our being able to wake up finally to what many people have known forever, you know?
And it's not coincidental that we're struggling with this whole idea of what's facts and evidence versus what we believe and that connection to reality, you know, and there is a real competition for that new grounding, I think.
Yeah, there's memory involved in this too. Paula, you might remember that some years ago, the Salina Arts Center, we had a special exhibit on memory. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading with Sarah Lynn, she pointed a couple of books out to me that I read, and they're talking about the unreliability of memory. And so witnesses on the witness stand, you know, they can't really be trusted because they remember what they think they remember. And it can be twisted around by a good attorney. And so our memory can be twisted around by politicians, for example, by pastors, by professors. You know, who's controlling the narrative and how, you know, one of the great tragedies of our culture today is that we don't really train people how to think critically. And so we're really at the mercy of whoever is creating the narrative.
Mhm. Mhm.
And for some strange reason, we don't value education that teaches people how to think critically. You know, the old saying about Jesuit instruction is the Jesuits didn't teach me what to think, they taught me how to think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's just not valued in our culture today. I'm on the board of a liberal arts university, and the liberal arts is just, you know, we're having to give up on much of what we have believed and strived for decades, because nobody is buying that. Nobody's interested. If you want students, you're not going to get them interested in the liberal arts. I hate to say that, but it's just true.
I think what might be helpful, as this was touched upon earlier, because of the opportunity, as you said, Frank, about this kind of crisis, and certainly the activism that we're seeing among young people that are demanding that we face our systemic and structural issues, does require that kind of ability to think critically and analytically. So, you know, perhaps we're seeing, you know, kind of a real press or pull to engage as a community more deeply in those kinds of intellectual and philosophical undertaking.
Yeah, that gives me great hope.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think so.
I can't think of a better person to talk more about some of the spiritual dimensions of life here, but if I could go back to Frank more directly, you know, at times like this, you know, what we've been talking about is it's really a time for deepening an understanding of what life means for us, asking those kind of deeper questions. And it's also exposing, I think, and that's been a part of the thread throughout our conversation, you know, what's really important and what's not, what's real and what's not, and what do we really value, what's important as a need versus a desire and a wish and so on. Where do our hearts truly lie? That kind of spiritual question. So, and I know you have a lot to share on that, and I think you can give us a window into the deeper dimensions of relationships generally, and the spiritual needs that we all have as social beings. So when we were first thinking about having Frank here, it just struck me that you would have some interesting things to say about the requirement now to have to social distance, the requirement to in some ways keep ourselves apart while we're doing all this reflecting. So I'd like to ask you, you know, are we changing in some more fundamental ways because of that as well? Are we transforming in some important ways? Are we, in terms of congregational life, are we harming or diminishing or actually enhancing long-term the kind of spiritual well-being of all of us? There's a lot packed into all of that, and there's a lot of directions you can go. So feel free to just comment generally. What kind of struggles are you seeing and in the church and so on?
Okay, on the surface level, you know, I hear lots of frustration that people can't gather socially and ecclesially and all that. And, you know, here in my parish, we video and put on our website Mass every day, not just the weekends, but the daily Masses as well. And you know, a number of people have tuned into that, and it's been helpful for them. They've expressed their gratitude, but they've also said it's not the same, which is, you know, pretty obvious. I'm glad to hear that it's not the same, because eventually, I mean, eventually we need to stop this and get back to gathering. And so I guess I want to step out a little bit on that notion. You know, the Greek word for church, ekklesia, means the gathering. And so the Christian church, and I'm sure it's true of other religions as well, but for Christianity, it's always been about congregating. I mean, that's why the word congregation is such an essential part of our faith tradition. And, you know, we've always had a tradition of hermits, for example, and monks and cloistered nuns and things like that. And so, you know, the individual faith and the deep contemplative prayer life has always been part of the Christian tradition too. But it always, in some way, has to be in touch with the community. Thomas Merton, back in the 1970s, for example, said that you know, a hermit like himself was connected to the world. He said people don't get into, they don't become monks in order to escape the world, or if they do, that's the wrong motivation. You leave the world to join the world through prayer. And so even in the most hermetic kind of prayer life, there's always some connection to the community. Okay, my concern is that we have become more and more of a techno-connecting parish. You know, I've had to learn how to do things that I didn't before. We are now contemplating hiring a staff person for communication, you know, things that we didn't think about before. You know, the traditional means of the parish bulletin and or newsletter, things like that are, they're just not cutting it anymore. You know, we're having to do all kinds of new things. I'm even doing cooking shows, if you can believe that, and can't believe the response to that, because it's connection. You know,
Yeah.
They're seeing me being human, which I find rather amusing because I never thought of myself as that inhuman. But, but the comments I'm getting is, you're so human. Anyway, I'm happy about all that, but I'm a little concerned that that would somehow replace actually gathering. Mm-hmm. And so at the risk of launching out into too philosophical a perspective here, I think there is some insight to what I'm going to say. And that is, you know, for decades, almost a century now in Europe, people have gone to church less and less. And 50 years ago, you know, everybody in France was a baptized Catholic, but nobody was going to church. Same thing in Italy. And we used to refer to, and this is when I was studying in Rome back in the 80s, we used to refer to Europe as post-Christian, you know. And but back in the 80s, I thought, but America will never get there. But we're there, you know. Fewer and fewer Christians in America, and it's been decreasing steadily for the last 50 years. Fewer and fewer people are congregating. And when Americans are polled, they say things like, well, I'm a believer, I believe in God, but I'm not religious. I don't belong to an organized religion. I don't feel the need to gather with other people. I can do that on my own. I can read the Bible, etc. Well, there are two dangers that I see about that. One is, if we don't congregate, we will lose our faith altogether. Maybe you and your generation can do that individually and privately, but it's not going to pass on to your children. Because this has been proven in Europe and it's being proven in America. If you don't join together, if you don't congregate, you lose your faith eventually. Okay, that's the first problem. And then the second problem is, and I'm going to speak specifically as a Catholic here. I believe that a big part of being Catholic is acquiescing to the authority of the group. So, for example, we pay attention to what the Pope says. We pay attention to what our bishop says. In many Protestant traditions, you hire a pastor, and if he doesn't preach the way you like, you fire him. In the Catholic tradition, you are assigned a pastor, and like it or lump it, that's who you get. And so he's a little freer to tell you the truth, even if you don't want to hear it. And we also had a tradition that's passing away of saying, okay, within these boundaries, from this street to that street, from this street to that street, you're in such and such parish. Like it or lump it. Those are the people to whom you've been assigned. Live with it. Learn to love them. Learn from them. Teach them. Rub shoulders with this community, because that's going to form them and it's going to form you. And we speak of family and marriage as a microcosm of that larger community. Well, it's the same thing. Two people commit themselves to rubbing against each other in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, until death do them part. You know, in other words, a serious commitment to this. And I think one of the dangers in our contemporary culture is, I'll do this as long as it's comfortable, but then I'm going to find another church where I'm comfortable. Or I'm gonna love you as long as it feels good, but when it doesn't feel good anymore, I'm going to stop loving you. I'm not going to allow you to form me. I'll do that myself. Thank you very much. So those are just a couple of dangers that I see, and why I really want to get back to gathering for church.
It strikes me, thinking about what you said about, well, not only the difference between Protestant and Catholic churches, but the difference between more collective cultures and individualistic kind of cultures as well. When there's an authority structure, you know, our churches are also becoming silos for being around people that agree with you, you know.
Yeah.
So that idea of a much more collective, at least obedience to some authority here, seems to be a fundamental one, especially when we look out and see the divisions that are getting deeper and deeper, and the lack of communication with people who we can have a civil conversation with, who are very different in their background, experiences, beliefs, and so on and so forth, which is where our need really is.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think it was James Baldwin who said the most segregated place in America is Sunday morning in our churches.
Yeah.
And that's not just about racism. It's also about rich versus poor,
Right.
You know, different classes, and different political opinions, you know. And in large cities where you have suburbs of like-minded and you know, people, it's a little harder to, and I don't know how you control that. I don't know how you help that. Human nature is what it is. But I think even in somewhat homogeneous communities, there can be some growth that wouldn't be there if we were isolated.
I'd like to also go back to a point you made about gathering versus technology, and that those two different kinds, you know, physically gathering and so on, because and I'd like, you know, Paula to comment on this too. You know, what is the technology doing to us? But it also is very much a part of the conversation around schools now, and the emotional difficulties of kids not going to school, and then the emotional difficulties that come with them going to school and that need to socialize and gather and so on. So whatever comments you have about that hard choice that parents are now having to make all over the country, and just emotionally and psychologically, but also in terms of community and, you know, developing those narratives for ourselves as individuals and developing individuals. So either one of you, if you want to jump into, again, we've got about 10 minutes here, but feel free to respond.
Well, one thing that comes to my mind is that if you, the more people rely on the internet, let's say. There are, again, Catholic is an example. There are millions of sites, and 90% of it is garbage. But who's able to sift through and say what's true? And I'm sure in the Jewish community it's a similar kind of thing. There are all kinds of crazy ideas about what Judaism is and isn't, and so I hesitate to talk too much about control, but there is some need to control. That's why the rabbis got together about 100 years before Christ and burned all the non-canonical texts because they wanted some kind of control over the narrative. And then a couple hundred years after Christ, a bunch of bishops got together and they didn't burn the extra ones, but they made decisions about what was canonical. And so there is an ebb and flow about control and freedom. And I guess one final comment about that is, in a previous time, there was a certain self-checking, like in the academic community. You write a book on some aspect of psychology, and if the academic psychological community finds that bunk, they're going to say so. They're going to give you bad reviews, and you're not going to go anywhere. So they police themselves, and theologians do the same thing. But nobody's policing the internet. Nobody's policing Facebook. And we hear that commented on, can't Facebook, control this? And how can they? I mean, I can't blame Facebook entirely. I understand what they're up against too. So it's a dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll chime in by saying that I share many of your concerns about technology, and particularly like these sort of Zoom formats that say that so many therapists like myself have had to use to do our work. And it's been, an invaluable alternative, for being able to continue to do therapy. I would say in some cases it's maybe even been a little beneficial, like for someone to be able to be talking with me in their own space where they feel more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But we also know from the neuroscience literature that there's like this slight delay in transmission that we're not really wired. Our brains haven't evolved to manage well. So it's fatiguing and exhausting after a day of doing this kind of thing. So I tend to like to think about so many of these issues that way. What are the benefits that we're deriving from it, and what are the costs? And one thing that I'm finding really fascinating is that I'm hearing many younger people developing their own strategies for managing their internet or technology use in general. There's parent groups that are now really intentional about limiting their kids' access to technology and wanting to support each other around that. One of my young adult children was telling me that there are apps you can get that turn your phone off for you for certain chunks of the day to like help you develop the habit of not using your phone all the time. Mm-hmm. So that gives me hope, right? That we are an evolving, adapting species, and that, that there's reason to think that we may solve some of these problems together. But I think that the challenge for us as a community is great. I'm veering just a slightly different direction here, but that Governor Kelly referenced earlier, the fact that there's become sides to this political, the health issues have become political. And, I remember before we had the mask mandate, and now in our community, it appears really most people are wearing masks since our city commission and county commissioners affirmed that. But I'd say a month or so ago, before that was the case, the grocery store had come to feel like a contested space to me, a place that has never felt political. Like, I love going to the grocery store. I see people I know. I love being around food. I love to cook. I love being there with my community, all out preparing to feed themselves and their families. And it completely shifted into me being so conspicuously aware of myself as a mask wearer and other mask wearers and those who weren't mask wearers, and all of us sort of eyeing each other, wondering, what is this communicating something? Did I just forget my mask in the car and that's why I'm not wearing one? Or am I taking a stance? You know, or am I wearing a mask because I've got a health issue, or am I taking a stance? And all of a sudden it was such a loss to have this place that has never felt political feel charged. And I just think we're really challenged to think about that as a community, because at the local level, we've tended to not be fragmented like that. We've tended to work well together at solving problems. Mm-hmm. And I hope we can find a way to really keep amplifying that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on a totally different note, when Governor Kelly was talking, I was thinking about you, Paula. Some years ago, when your children were in high school, you led some kind of a movement at Central High about communicating among the different races and types of people. Do you remember that?
Well, I wasn't really a leader, but I definitely participated in trying to be part of conversations that were cross-racial. We've had moments in our community where there's been flare-ups, and I think there had been one of those. And the school climate committee was in place, and I joined that. You're giving me too much credit, but I've always really cared about those issues, absolutely.
Yeah.
What were you thinking about that?
Well, I was just thinking how the dialogue is going to be so essential, and how difficult it is to create dialogue.
Yes.
And, you know, with particularly in this polarized political environment that we have now, genuine dialogue is difficult to pull off. Mm-hmm. And that's always been one of my gifts, is the ability to be non-threatening and facilitate different people of differing opinions and get them talking without screaming at each other. Mm-hmm. I hate doing it. It's just such hard work. But I do kind of feel a bit of a call to do that. Even when I'm working on liturgical building and renovation projects, you know, working with committees where you're trying to help everyone to feel heard, you know, about their position. And you know, sometimes you just want to, you're driving home from a meeting like that and you're thinking, why can't we just do this and not talk about it? Mm-hmm. But the fact is, that's not real, is it? I mean, we have to, the dialogue is essential.
Well, and to build on that, you know, psychologists love to say that the nature of human relationships is rupture and repair, rupture and repair, rupture and repair. So the difference between really successful relationships and unsuccessful relationships is not the absence of conflict, right? It's the skill in repairing. And, you know, I often say this in my practice, you know, when we're having a constructive disagreement that is, you know, talking about something really important to us and we're not agreeing, but we stay in it, even if we can't solve it, but we stay in it to hear and be heard. It's like taking the relationship to the gym. You know, it's like giving it, you know, a set of reps so that we are building those relational muscles, and that we can't get good at it without doing it. And you're right, it is hard work, it's exhausting. Our feelings get hurt. We run over somebody else's feelings. We have to then name that, fix it. But that's how we grow.
Yeah. So Paula, do you think COVID-19 is contributing to the rupturing of relationships, maybe not so healthy relationships, so that we can work on skills for refixing those? And is it playing that kind of role as well, meaning maybe a little bit more positive role or not? I think
it's a beautiful way to think about it, that, you know, there are going to be so many ruptures that need to be mended. And how we think about that at the community level, I think, is just a brilliant question. And how where are the corners and the intersections and sidewalks where that needs to happen. And, you know, in congregations and around lunch tables. And
yeah, I think that's really true. In ecclesial terms, we would, instead of rupture and repair, we'd talk about sin and reconciliation.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But reconciliation and healing, it's the same thing as repair.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it's essential. It's not that we're ever a perfect community, but we learn how to be reconcilers and healers.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Well, alas, we're getting close to running out of time. I'll probably want to keep you guys on afterwards so we can talk.
I was going to say, do we have to end?
Yeah. But anyway, before we close, I want to remind all of you who are watching here that you can email us any questions that have come out of this discussion and from our next panel as well. Again, we hope you are able to address those and send for our third and final panel of the series, and that's going to be aired on August 19th. So the next one will be August 12th, and then the final one August 19th. And please email any questions to, you can write this down, I'll say it twice, communications@FPC Salina, that's all one word, .org. So communications@fpcsalina.org. A final reminder, our next panel presentation is entitled Possibilities in Hope, Hope in Possibilities. That we spilled over into that a little bit today, but it'll be a different kind of focus because on that day we'll have with us former California Governor Jerry Brown, research fellow and author at the Land Institute Stan Cox, and Academy Award-winning filmmaker and writer Kevin Wilmot from University of Kansas. In closing, on behalf of the First Presbyterian Church in Salina and the Solstice Series planners, I'd like to really thank each of our panelists, including Governor Kelly again, for your participation and for the continuing important work of service that you're providing for so many people during this time. And I think you can count all of us viewers today among recipients of that service. So I want to thank you all once again, close this particular panel, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.